Palace of Versailles began its life in 1623 as a quiet, practical retreat rather than a statement of grandeur. Commissioned by Louis XIII, the original structure was little more than a brick and stone hunting lodge, surrounded by forests and marshland. Its purpose was simple: to provide the king with a controlled environment for hunting and temporary withdrawal from the pressures of Paris, a city often restless and politically unpredictable. The choice of Versailles was not accidental. Though modest, the site offered distance from the volatile urban crowds, while remaining close enough to the capital to maintain authority. Roads could be monitored, access could be regulated, and the surrounding landscape allowed for isolation without exile. In this sense, Versailles already hinted at a new way of ruling, power exercised from a carefully chosen space rather than from the heart of the city itself. Over the following decades, the lodge evolved gradually rather than dramatically. Louis XIII ordered expansions that improved comfort and permanence, transforming the hunting retreat into a recognizable royal residence. These early additions were restrained, reflecting a king more concerned with order and control than spectacle. Yet even these changes signalled that Versailles was no longer a temporary refuge. It was becoming a place the monarchy intended to return to again and again. After Louis XIII's death, the estate entered a transitional phase under the regency and early reign of Louis XIV. Though still young, the future Sun King inherited not only the property, but also its potential. The existing buildings, gardens, and hunting grounds formed a framework upon which more ambitious ideas could be imagined, even if they had not yet been fully realized. During this period, Versailles remained secondary to Paris, but its symbolic value quietly increased. Court visits became more frequent, ceremonies more deliberate, and the physical space more refined. Each visit reinforced the idea that authority could be staged, observed, and controlled through architecture and environment rather than through force alone. By 1661, Versailles stood at a threshold. It was no longer merely a hunting lodge, yet not fully the palace it would soon become. The foundations, physical, political, and symbolic, were firmly in place. What had begun as a private retreat was ready to be transformed into a royal vision that would redefine monarchy, space, and power in France. The reign of Louis XIV marked a decisive break with earlier models of kingship. From the beginning of his personal rule in 1661, he rejected shared authority and weak regencies, choosing instead to concentrate power entirely in his own hands. Government, law, and military command were no longer distant institutions. They flowed directly from the will of the monarch, shaping a new political reality in France. Architecture became one of the most visible tools of this transformation. The palace was redesigned not merely as a residence, but as a physical manifesto of royal supremacy. Long sightlines, vast courtyards, and grand ceremonial halls were arranged to direct attention toward the king's presence. Every stone and façade reinforced the idea that order, harmony, and power originated from a single source. Court ceremony was equally deliberate. Daily rituals, from the king's morning rising to his public meals, were turned into formal events, governed by strict hierarchy. Access to the monarch became a privilege carefully rationed, binding nobles to his favour and presence. Participation in these rituals replaced political independence, subtly transforming the aristocracy into dependents of the crown. Life at court revolved around proximity. Rank was measured not only by title, but by physical closeness to the king, whether during ceremonies, councils, or leisure. By drawing the elite into this controlled environment, Louis XIV neutralized regional power bases and reduced the risk of rebellion. The court became both a stage and a cage, dazzling yet restrictive. Administration followed the same principle of centralization. Royal officials, appointed and dismissed at the king's discretion, forced policy across the kingdom. Decisions were recorded, standardized, and enforced in his name, diminishing the influence of local traditions and autonomous institutions. Authority was no longer negotiated, it was administered. By shaping architecture, ritual, and governance into a single system, Louis XIV created more than a powerful monarchy. He established a model of absolute rule. The king was not merely the head of state, he was the state itself, embodied in space, ceremony, and daily life, setting a precedent that would define French power for generations. At Palace of Versailles, architecture functioned as a language of power. The layout was conceived not for comfort alone, but for visibility, movement, and control. Long corridors, expansive courtyards, and carefully framed perspectives guided how people entered, moved, and gathered, ensuring that space itself enforced discipline and hierarchy. The palace's axes were not random lines, but deliberate statements. Central alignments drew the eye forward, often towards symbolic, focal points associated with royal presence. This geometric clarity suggested stability and order, presenting the monarchy as a force that imposed structure upon both nature and society. Even the surrounding landscape was reshaped to obey this visual logic. Facades played a public role in this performance. Repetition, symmetry, and scale conveyed permanence and authority, discouraging any sense of improvisation or weakness. From the outside, the palace appeared immutable, as if it had always existed in its monumental form. This illusion of timelessness reinforced the idea that royal power was natural and unquestionable. Inside, space dictated behavior. Grand halls encouraged assembly and observation, while narrower passages controlled access and flow. Movement through the palace was a process of gradual revelation, where status determined how far one could advance. Architecture replaced spoken commands, silently instructing courtiers where they belonged. Decoration amplified this message without relying on excess alone. Ceilings, walls, and floors were integrated into a unified visual narrative that celebrated authority, discipline, and cosmic order. The scale of these interiors diminished the individual, placing every visitor, regardless of rank, within a framework dominated by royal symbolism. In this way, Versailles became more than a residence or administrative centre. It operated as a continuous performance in stone, space, and movement. Architecture did not simply house power, it enacted it, transforming daily presence into a carefully staged expression of control and hierarchy. Within the Hall of Mirrors, power was not declared, it was reflected. Stretching along the palace's central axis, the gallery transformed light into spectacle, turning architecture into persuasion. Sunlight entered through tall windows and multiplied endlessly across mirrored surfaces, creating a visual experience that overwhelmed the senses before a single word was spoken. The mirrors themselves were a statement of ambition and control. At a time when mirror production was rare and technically demanding, their sheer number signaled economic strength and industrial mastery. What appeared decorative was in fact strategic, demonstrating that the French crown could command resources, skill, and innovation on a scale few rivals could match. This space was carefully positioned between the royal apartments, making it unavoidable during formal movement through the palace. Nobles and officials passed through it repeatedly, absorbing its message through repetition, Each crossing reinforced a hierarchy in which the king occupied the centre, while others existed within a reflected order shaped by his authority. Ceremony gave the gallery its political voice. Diplomatic receptions, formal processions, and public announcements unfolded beneath glittering chandeliers and painted ceilings. Foreign envoys encountered not just the king, but an environment engineered to impress, intimidate, and persuade. The setting itself argued France's supremacy long before negotiations began. The imagery surrounding the hall reinforced this effect. Ceiling paintings celebrated victories, stability, and divine favour, aligning royal power with cosmic order. Reflections doubled these images, blurring the boundary between reality and representation. Power appeared infinite, continuous, and inescapable, an illusion carefully maintained through design. Over time, the Hall of Mirrors became more than an architectural marvel. It functioned as a diplomatic weapon and a psychological stage where light, reflection, and movement shaped perception. In this gallery, authority did not merely reside, it was performed, multiplied, and made unforgettable. The gardens of Palace of Versailles were conceived as an extension of political order into the natural world. Their design rejected wilderness and spontaneity, replacing them with measured lines, controlled growth, and carefully framed views. Nature was not admired for its freedom, but reshaped to obey a precise and visible system. Geometry governed every element. Paths followed strict axes. Parterres were drawn like diagrams, and trees were trimmed into disciplined forms. These choices created a landscape that could be read at a glance, reinforcing the idea that clarity and control were virtues of good rule. Nothing was left to chance, and nothing escaped alignment. Water, often unpredictable by nature, became another tool of mastery. Fountains activated on command, channels redirected rivers, and basins reflected the sky with engineered calm. The movement of water was calculated and rehearsed, turning a natural force into a spectacle of obedience and technical skill. Long perspectives played a crucial psychological role. From key vantage points, the eye was drawn outward along endless lines that seemed to stretch toward the horizon. These views suggested continuity and permanence, implying that authority extended far beyond the immediate foreground into the distance itself. The gardens also structured behaviour. Movement through outdoor space followed planned routes, guiding visitors from one controlled scene to another. Surprise was allowed only where intended, ensuring that experience unfolded according to design rather than impulse. Even leisure took place within boundaries defined by power. In shaping land, water, and vegetation into a disciplined whole, Versailles projected a clear message. Just as the landscape submitted to geometry and command, so too did the kingdom submit to centralized rule. The gardens were not merely decorative, they were a living metaphor for dominion, order, and control. Life inside the Palace of Versailles unfolded within a system designed for visibility. Thousands of nobles resided in close proximity, not as independent elites, but as participants in a carefully monitored environment. Privacy was limited, movement was noticed, and reputation depended on how one appeared within the daily rhythm of court life. Ritual transformed routine into meaning. Actions as ordinary as waking, dressing, eating, or retiring for the night were formalized, assigned ranks, and regulated by custom. These moments were no longer personal. They were public performances where status was confirmed and favor quietly negotiated through presence and timing. Observation replaced force as a method of control. courtiers watched one another as closely as they watched the monarch, aware that conduct, alliances, and even silence could carry consequences. Information travelled quickly through corridors and salons, creating a culture where awareness and self-discipline were essential to survival. Access became currency. Invitations, positions, and simple proximity determined influence more effectively than titles alone. By centralizing social life, the court redirected ambition inward, encouraging competition for recognition rather than resistance. Loyalty was cultivated through dependence on daily visibility rather than formal command. Space reinforced this dynamic. Crowded apartments, shared antechambers, and ceremonial routes ensured constant interaction. Encounters were rarely accidental, and every meeting took place within an architecture that favoured scrutiny. The palace functioned as a living network, where presence equaled relevance. Through ritual and surveillance, Versailles reshaped aristocratic life. The nobility remained privileged, but their independence dissolved into performance. Bound to the king's orbit by ceremony and watchful eyes, they became participants in a system where power was sustained not by coercion, but by continual observation and controlled ritual. In 1682, Palace of Versailles crossed a decisive threshold. What had long functioned as a ceremonial and symbolic centre was formally declared the seat of government. Power no longer operated in the shadow of Paris. It was relocated to a space designed to embody control, visibility, and hierarchy at every level. This move altered the geography of authority. Councils, ministries, and royal offices were transferred into the palace complex, embedding administration within the king's immediate environment. Decision-making became inseparable from court life, ensuring that politics unfolded under direct royal oversight rather than through distant institutions. Diplomacy followed the same path. Foreign ambassadors no longer negotiated in neutral urban settings, but within a palace engineered to impress and dominate. Every audience took place against a backdrop of calculated grandeur, where architecture and ceremony framed political exchange before words were even spoken. Centralization also reshaped bureaucratic practice. Records, decrees, and correspondence flowed through Versailles, tightening the link between policy and royal will. Officials operated under constant proximity to power, reducing autonomy while increasing efficiency and uniformity across the kingdom. The relocation carried symbolic weight beyond administration. By making Versailles the capital, the monarchy asserted that authority resided not in a city, a parliament, or a tradition, but in the person of the king and the space he controlled. Governance became a lived, visible presence rather than an abstract system. Versailles thus evolved into more than a palace or court. It became the nerve centre of France, where ceremony and statecraft merged into a single structure. From within its walls, power was observed, exercised, and projected, reshaping how a nation was ruled. Under Louis XV, Versailles entered a quieter phase. The palace remained the official seat of power, but the tone of royal life shifted noticeably. Public spectacle gave way to a preference for comfort, privacy, and controlled intimacy, reflecting a monarch less inclined toward constant display. Architectural changes mirrored this transformation. Large ceremonial spaces retained their function. Yet, increasing attention was given to smaller, more secluded rooms. Private apartments expanded, allowing the king to withdraw from the rigid rhythms of court ritual. Power was still present, but it was exercised with less visual insistence. Court life adjusted accordingly. While nobles continued to reside at Versailles, access to the monarch became more limited and selective. Informal gatherings replaced grand ceremonies, and influence was increasingly shaped behind closed doors rather than in public halls. Authority became quieter, but also more opaque. The reign of Louis XVI deepened this inward turn. The palace functioned more as a residence than a stage, reflecting a ruler uncomfortable with theatrical authority. Daily life became domestic in tone, with family routines and personal interests shaping the rhythm of the royal household. This retreat had political consequences. As visibility diminished, so did the symbolic connection between the monarchy and the broader nobility. Versailles remained impressive, yet it no longer projected the same commanding presence. Distance replaced dominance, and the palace began to feel detached from the realities beyond its gates. By the late 18th century, Versailles still stood as a monumental symbol of royal tradition, but its purpose had subtly changed. What had once been a public theatre of power evolved into a private world of retreat. The architecture remained grand, yet the energy that once animated it had shifted inward, signalling a monarchy increasingly removed from the stage it had created. The French Revolution shattered the world that Palace of Versailles had been built to sustain. What once embodied authority, hierarchy, and ritual suddenly became a symbol of excess and distance from the people. The palace's meaning shifted almost overnight, transformed from a centre of power into an object of suspicion and resentment. The turning point came when revolutionary pressure forced the royal family to leave Versailles for Paris. With their departure, the palace lost its political function and its living core. The court system that had animated its halls dissolved, and the carefully staged rhythms of royal life came to an abrupt end. Symbols of monarchy were systematically dismantled. Emblems, furnishings, and ceremonial objects were removed, sold, or destroyed. Rooms designed to glorify kings were emptied, their purpose stripped away along with their occupants. Grandeur remained in form, but its authority was gone. Administration and governance followed the same fate. Offices once filled with officials, scribes, and courtiers fell silent. Decisions that had shaped an empire no longer originated within these walls. Versailles became a shell, vast, impressive, and politically irrelevant. The palace's transformation reflected a deeper rupture. The revolution rejected not only royal rule, but the entire culture of spectacle and hierarchy that Versailles represented. The idea that power could be staged through architecture and ritual was replaced by new ideals centered on citizenship and popular sovereignty. In the aftermath, Versailles survived, but as a relic rather than a throne. Its halls preserved the memory of a vanished system, offering a silent record of how absolute power had once been displayed, and how completely it had fallen. Today, the Palace of Versailles exists far beyond its original role as a royal residence. No longer a seat of power, it has become a historical monument where architecture, art, and politics converge. Its spaces are preserved not to govern, but to remember how authority was once constructed and displayed. As a museum and cultural landmark, Versailles presents monarchy as history rather than reality. Visitors move through halls once reserved for courtiers and diplomats, now reframed as evidence of an era that shaped Europe. Paintings, furnishings, and interiors are curated to explain power rather than enforce it, transforming dominance into narrative. The palace also gained a new identity as a site of modern political memory. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in the Hall of Mirrors, deliberately echoing the language of past authority. The setting linked a new global order to an old imperial stage, using history itself as a diplomatic tool. This moment redefined Versailles once again. The same gallery that had projected royal supremacy now witnessed the redrawing of Europe after war. Power no longer belonged to a single monarch, yet the choice of location showed how symbolic spaces could still shape political meaning. Beyond diplomacy, Versailles functions as a global cultural reference. It influences art, film, literature, and collective imagination, often serving as shorthand for absolute power, luxury, and excess. Its image circulates worldwide, detached from its original court, yet inseparable from its legacy. Versailles has thus completed a long transformation. From royal palace to revolutionary relic, and from historical monument to global symbol, it endures not as a centre of rule, but as a place where power, memory, and meaning continue to intersect across centuries.